The north wind blew fiercely through the fjord. It was a freezing air that carried the smell of the sea and frozen pine. In the village of Vik, beside water as black as night, the sound of chopping axes had been echoing since dawn. Einar, the best carpenter in the region, stood in front of a gigantic tree. It was a massive oak, a giant that had been growing on the forest slope for 300 years. Its roots ran so deep that the elders of the village said they touched the world of the dead. "Look at that curve in the trunk, Einar," said Halvar, a young warrior with a red beard and broad shoulders. "It looks like the back of a sleeping monster." "It's no monster, Halvar," Einar replied, touching the wood that was as hard as stone. "It's the foundation of our future ship. This tree didn't grow to give shade to animals. It grew to cut through ocean waves." Beside him, Jarl Torstein watched in silence. The Jarl was an older man, his face covered in battle scars and a leather patch over his left eye. His single eye gleamed with impatience. The Saxons of England had burned his villages the previous summer, and he needed vengeance. But to cross the sea, fishing boats wouldn't do. They needed a fast, strong, and deadly warship. They needed a Drakkar. "Will it be ready to sail before the deep cold arrives, carpenter?" Torstein asked, touching the hilt of his sword. "A good ship isn't made in a rush, Jarl," Einar answered. "If you hurry the wood, the gods will punish you in the middle of the sea, and the ship will snap like a toy. Tomorrow we will sacrifice a black stallion to the gods so they grant us their blessing." That very night, smoke from the sacred pyre rose toward the stars. The village priest, a blind old man dressed in wolf skins, poured the sacrificial blood over the roots of the tree. At that exact moment, distant thunder rumbled across the cloudless sky. The men looked at each other in fear, but Halvar smiled. "The gods have accepted our offering," the young warrior said. The next day, 20 men began hacking at the trunk with heavy axes. The sound of metal against wood echoed for 3 full days. When the giant finally fell, the ground shook. A jet-black crow swooped down from above and landed on the fallen trunk. It stared at Einar, let out 3 sharp caws, and flew into the mist. "It's a good sign from Odin," Jarl Torstein said, "or a warning." For 3 months, the beach became a massive workshop filled with smoke, fire, and sweat. Einar didn't use saws to cut the planks. The Vikings knew that if they cut the wood bluntly, losing the natural shape of its grain, it would break under the force of the waves. Instead, they struck the wood with wedges so it would split on its own along its natural lines. That way, they got flexible planks that could bend without ever snapping. The keel, the main beam that would run along the bottom of the ship, was carved from the heart of the sacred oak. It was over 25 meters long. Speed doesn't just depend on the strength of the men rowing, Einar explained to his apprentices as they laid the hull planks. The secret is elasticity. The ship has to move in the water as if it were a living serpent. It must move with the wave, not crash against it. They placed each plank overlapping slightly with the one below it. To keep water from leaking in, the women of the village prepared a special paste made from sheep's wool, horsehair, and hot pine resin. The smell of smoke and pine filled the village air for weeks. To join the planks, they used hundreds of iron rivets forged by hand by Skardi, the blacksmith. Every rivet was driven in hot and hammered flat from the inside, so no one could ever move it. But the most impressive part was yet to come. The prow of the ship, the front tip where they would place the monster carved to terrify their enemies. Einar locked himself away for 5 days to carve the figure out of a block of hardwood. He barely ate and hardly slept. When he finally stepped into the sunlight, he revealed the monster's head to the tribe. It was the head of a giant serpent with open jaws, displaying rows of sharp teeth. Its eyes were two polished black stones that glinted with a mysterious aura. On the serpent's forehead, Einar had carved sacred symbols to bring luck and victory in battle. "It's terrifying," Jarl Torstein admitted, running his hand over the wood. "What shall we name her?" "Jörmungandr," Einar said, "like the world serpent of our legends. Because when this ship sails, the earth will tremble." However, the blind old priest approached the wooden carving. He touched the monster's face with his trembling hands and suddenly leaped back as if he had been burned. "I see blood on this wood," the old man shouted. "I see red water, men swallowed by the storm, and breaking swords. This ship will bring us riches, but it will also demand lives in return." The warriors froze, but Halvar, the red-bearded youth, let out a booming laugh and raised his axe. "We are warriors, not frightened farmers," Halvar roared. "If the ship wants blood, we will give it the blood of our enemies." All the men cheered, forgetting the old man's words. But Einar stared into the black eyes of the wooden serpent, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. The day arrived to launch the ship into the water. The sky was covered in gray clouds, and light snowflakes were falling. The whole village gathered on the shore to watch the event. The ship rested on a track made of wooden logs greased with ox fat, so it would slide smoothly. The vessel was a masterpiece. It had space for 16 pairs of oars along its sides. The large square sail was made of thick wool, reinforced with leather strips, and painted with alternating red and white stripes. The central mast holding the sail was a straight pine tree that rose into the sky like a spear. "Listen carefully," Einar told the men. "Now that we are going into the water, we must remove the serpent's head from the tip. If the guardian spirits of the sea see the face of the enraged monster, they will be frightened and place a curse on us. The head is only attached when we are near enemy lands to strike terror into them." "So it shall be done," the Jarl agreed. Jarl Torstein climbed onto a rock and raised his arms. Everyone fell silent. "Men of the coast," he shouted in a powerful voice. "For too long we have starved in winter while the kings of the south laughed at us. Today we launch our vengeance into the water. This ship will cut through the sea like a sword. Those who step aboard will return full of gold or go to Valhalla with the fallen heroes." The 40 warriors traveling on the ship began to shout fiercely. They beat their yellow and black shields with their swords, making a deafening noise. "Push," Halvar ordered. The strongest men grabbed the thick ropes. They pulled all at once, driving force through their legs. 1, 2, 3. They counted in unison. The ship creaked. The grease began to give, and the massive wooden vessel slid rapidly down the ramp of logs. When the stern touched the freezing water of the fjord, a wave of white foam burst into the air. The ship floated perfectly. It didn't tilt even an inch. It sat straight on the water with incredible grace. It sat shallow in the water, meaning it could sail not only through the deep sea, but also travel up shallow rivers without running aground. The crew boarded quickly, climbing up rope ladders. Among them were young Halvar, Skardi the blacksmith with his tools, and Einar himself, who wanted to see with his own eyes that his ship could handle the voyage. The Jarl took the helm, a giant or mounted on the rear right side. He moved the tiller gently, and the ship turned instantly with amazing agility. "Unfurl the sail," the Jarl shouted. The great red and white cloth dropped all at once. The north wind filled it with air in a fraction of a second. The ship surged forward, picking up tremendous speed on the calm waters of the fjord. The people on the beach cheered and waved goodbye until they turned into tiny dots in the distance. But as they left the fjord and entered the open sea, the weather turned violent. The air grew ice cold, and the calm waters turned into dark, massive waves several meters high. The first day in open water was brutal for everyone. The sky closed up with dark clouds that hid both the sun and the stars. Without sunlight, navigating was nearly impossible, and the Jarl could only rely on his instincts and the flight of seabirds. The ship creaked everywhere. That noise frightened the younger warriors, but it gave Einar peace of mind. He listened to the timbers flexing slightly with the impact of the waves. The elasticity he had talked about so much was working. The ship didn't slam against the water like a solid wall. It danced over it, adapting to the movement of the sea. "Bail the water out," Halvar shouted from the middle of the vessel. Even though the wood was well sealed, massive waves crested over the sides, dumping tons of freezing water inside. Two men worked tirelessly, scooping water out with wooden buckets to keep from sinking. By nightfall, the storm had turned savage. The wind blew with terrifying force. They had reefed almost the entire sail to keep the mast from snapping in half. Yet the ship still flew across the waves at a breakneck speed. Suddenly, a violent thud echoed beneath the hull. A tremendous impact shook the entire ship, throwing several warriors onto the wet deck. "A rock! We hit something!" The lookout at the bow screamed. "Impossible!" the Jarl shouted back, fighting the tiller with all his strength. "We are far too deep for land." Einar scrambled toward the front, holding onto the ropes for dear life. He leaned over the edge to see what had happened. What had hit the ship wasn't a rock. It was something alive. In the darkness of the raging sea, a massive creature with dark, scaly skin breached just a few meters away. It was the size of a building and plunged back underwater, creating a giant whirlpool that nearly capsized the ship. "It's no rock," Einar yelled, terrified. "It's a monster from the depths." Panic seized the men. They drew their swords, not knowing where to look. Others began praying to the gods so they wouldn't drown. "Don't lose your composure," Jarl Torstein barked with authority. "Halvar, get to the prow. Einar, check for leaks. If that beast wants war, we'll give it steel." The creature breached again, this time much closer. A giant, jagged fin cut through the water, heading straight for the side of the ship. It was going to slice the vessel in half. In that moment of sheer terror, Halvar grabbed the carved serpent head, the wooden monster tied down on the deck, and hoisted it high. With a furious battle cry, he jammed it onto the prow mount and locked it in place with an iron pin. "Look me in the face, beast," Halvar roared into the sea. "We bear the face of Odin's monster. Return to the depths, or we will kill you." Something incredible happened. Just as the black eyes of the wooden carving were revealed, a massive bolt of lightning split the sky and struck the water just meters from the ship. The blinding white light illuminated the sea creature beneath the surface. Frightened by the flash and the sound of divine thunder, the monster turned sharply and plunged into the deep, swimming away from them. The crew stood in silence, trembling and soaked by the rain. Slowly, the sea began to calm. The clouds parted for the first time in 2 days, and stars appeared in the night sky to guide their way. Einar collapsed against the wooden deck, feeling the heartbeat of the ship through his back. The vessel had survived its first real battle. The ship was alive. At dawn, the sky turned a pale shade of pink. On the horizon, massive white cliffs rose above the sea. "Land ho!" the lookout shouted. Jarl Torstein smiled, showing his worn teeth. He drew his sword and pointed toward the coast of England. "There lies our destination," he said. "The wooden serpent has arrived to strike." The English coast rose like a wall of white chalk above the gray ocean. Cold rain fell over the sea as Jarl Torstein guided the Jörmungandr toward a quiet bay. On the shore, a small Saxon fishing village sat peacefully, unaware of the nightmare approaching from the mist. "Quietly, men," Jarl Torstein ordered, his voice low. "Reds out, oars in the water." The 40 warriors sat on their wooden chests, pulling the long oars in perfect rhythm. Thanks to Einar's clever design, the shallow ship slid across the waves without making a sound, moving into the river mouth like a ghost. As the wooden serpent approached the beach, the carved head at the prow stared blindly at the wooden houses of the village. The black stones in its eyes seemed to absorb the dim light of dawn. "Look at them," Halvar whispered, gripping his axe tightly. "They have no guards. They think the sea protects them." "The sea belongs to no man, Saxon," Jarl Torstein muttered, pulling his broadsword from its scabbard. "And today it belongs to Odin." The ship's keel ground softly against the wet sand of the beach. The moment the vessel stopped, Halvar was the first to jump over the wooden side into the knee-deep water, holding his shield and axe high. "For Hordaland," Halvar roared. The 40 Vikings charged out of the ship, shouting war cries that shattered the silence of the morning. Alarm bells began to ring wildly in the village tower. Saxon men ran out of their homes holding spears and wooden shields, trying desperately to form a line of defense. "Keep the wall tight," screamed a Saxon captain, a tall soldier wearing a metal helmet. "Don't let them advance." The two groups crashed together with a brutal sound of wood and iron breaking. Swords struck shields, and spears bit into leather armor. Halvar charged directly into the center of the Saxon line like a wild beast. He swung his two-handed axe in broad circles, smashing through wooden shields and sending enemy soldiers tumbling into the mud. Behind him, Skardi the blacksmith fought with a heavy war hammer, crushing helmets and breaking spears with every strike. Einar, though he was a builder rather than a warrior, stayed close to Jarl Torstein, protecting his flank with a short spear. "Push them back to the river," the Saxon captain ordered, thrusting his spear toward Halvar's chest. Halvar caught the spearhead with the rim of his shield, locking it in place. With a ferocious grin, he stepped inside the captain's guard and brought his axe down, ending the officer's command in a single strike. Seeing their leader fall, the rest of the Saxon defenders panicked. They threw down their weapons and fled toward the nearby woods, leaving the village undefended. The battle was over in less than an hour. The Vikings moved through the village, gathering bags of grain, smoked meat, silver coins from the local church, and fine wool blankets to take back home. "A good harvest," Jarl Torstein said, wiping blood from his blade with a rag. "Our families won't starve this winter." "Jarl, look at the river," Skardi shouted from the shore, pointing deeper inland. Through the rising mist, 3 large Saxon warships were approaching fast. They were heavier and slower than the Drakkar, but they carried over 100 armed soldiers sent from the nearby fortress. "They knew we were coming," Einar said, his heart pounding against his ribs. The village bell warned the garrison. "We can't outrun them down the river," Halvar said, wiping sweat and blood from his forehead. "The wind is blowing against us." Jarl Torstein looked at the Jörmungandr resting peacefully on the sand. The tide was going out, and the water level in the river was dropping rapidly. Their heavy ships need deep water to move. Einar suddenly realized, his eyes lighting up. "Our ship is light. We can navigate the shallow sandbars where they will get stuck." "To the oars," Jarl Torstein barked. "Load the silver and get moving." The Vikings shoved the heavy bags of loot into the hull and pushed the Jörmungandr back into the river. The Saxon fleet was closing in, archers standing at their bows, pulling back their bowstrings. A cloud of black arrows rained down on the Drakkar. "Shields up," Halvar screamed. The warriors locked their round shields together over their heads, creating a roof of wood and iron. Arrows slammed against the shields with loud thuds, embedding themselves deep into the wood. A few arrows struck the side of the ship, but Einar's thick oak planks held firm, stopping the shafts cold. "Row! Row for your lives!" Jarl Torstein commanded from the helm. The Jörmungandr accelerated down the narrow river path. The Saxon ships pressed hard on their tail, their captains shouting orders to ram the Viking vessel and crush it against the bank. Up ahead, the river split into two channels separated by a broad, hidden sandbar beneath the muddy water. To an outsider, both channels looked the same, but Einar recognized the signs of shallow water from his years studying currents. "Steer left, Jarl," Einar yelled, pointing toward the murky water. "Keep the ship right along the edge of the reeds." "Are you mad, carpenter?" Halvar called out, pulling hard on his oar. "There's barely any water over there. Trust the wood." Einar shouted back. "This ship was built for this." Jarl Torstein didn't hesitate. He swung the tiller hard, turning the long wooden serpent into the shallow left channel. The bottom of the ship scraped gently against the mud, but because the hull was light and flexible, it slid over the obstacle without stopping. The lead Saxon ship tried to follow them into the turn, but its heavy, deep hull was far too thick for the shallows. With a deafening crunch of splintering timber, the primary Saxon warship slammed directly into the hidden sandbar. The sudden stop threw dozens of Saxon soldiers into the freezing river. The second Saxon vessel, moving too fast to turn, crashed straight into the back of the first, trapping both ships in a chaotic pile of broken oars and screaming men. "They're stuck," Skardi laughed, raising his hammer in triumph. The third Saxon ship managed to stop in time, but it could only watch as the agile Viking Drakkar glided effortlessly past the wreckage, reaching the safety of the deep ocean. Standing at the stern, Halvar looked back at the stranded enemies and let out a victorious roar that echoed across the river banks. "You built a ghost, Einar," Halvar shouted, slapping the carpenter on the shoulder. "A ghost that dances on mud." Einar smiled faintly, running his fingers along the inner curve of the oak hull. The ship had flexed just as he intended, bending with the pressure instead of snapping under the strain. However, as they cleared the mouth of the river and returned to the open sea, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple. The wind did not carry the smell of rain this time. It carried the scent of ozone and burning wood. From the top of the mast, the lookout shouted in a voice filled with sudden dread. "Jarl, ships on the horizon. Red sails." Jarl Torstein squinted through the dim light. Coming out of the northern fog were four massive warships, far larger than theirs, bearing the flag of a rival Viking warlord known across the seas as Eirik the Bloodaxe. "He waited for us to do the dirty work," Jarl Torstein growled, his face hardening. "He wants our silver, and he wants our ship." "We can't outrun four ships in open water," Halvar said, his hand sliding back to the grip of his axe. "Then we don't run," Jarl Torstein said, a grim smile spreading across his scarred face. "We give the serpent what it was made for." The north wind blew fiercely, billowing the large red sails of the four enemy ships. They approached in a fan formation, blocking the Jörmungandr's path to corner it against the rocky coast. Eirik the Bloodaxe, a mercenary warlord feared for his cruelty, led the charge in the largest ship, a massive vessel with its prow carved into the shape of a hungry wolf. "They have us surrounded, Jarl," shouted Skardi the blacksmith, tightening his grip on his warhammer. "They can't follow us if we move fast," Einar replied, watching the waves. "Their ships are heavy. They carry too many men and too much metal." Our ship is light and can turn on a dime. Listen well, Jarl Torstein said, raising his gleaming sword. Eric thinks we are easy prey loaded with loot. He thinks we will try to run. Let's show him that this dragon doesn't run. This dragon bites. The Jarl pulled the tiller hard. Instead of veering away into the open sea, he turned the prow of the Jörmungandr directly toward Eric's flagship. The Viking warriors let out a battle cry, grabbed the oars, and began rowing with all their strength. The ship accelerated across the water at an astonishing speed, cutting through the waves like a knife. On the enemy vessel, Eric's men were stunned to see a single small ship dare to charge head-on into 4 warships. Ready the bows, the enemy captain shouted from the wolf ship. A volley of flaming arrows flew through the air, leaving trails of black smoke across the sky. Most fell into the sea with a hiss, but several struck the red and white sail of the Jörmungandr, igniting the cloth. Einar, put out that fire, Halvar ordered while shielding the rowers with his shield. Einar ran to the middle of the ship, scooped up a bucket of seawater, and doused the sail, smothering the flames before they could destroy the fabric. Meanwhile, the distance between the 2 ships closed rapidly. They were about to collide head-on. To the left. Turn left now, Einar screamed to the Jarl. At the very last second, when the 2 ships were just meters from crashing bow to bow, Torstein yanked the tiller to the limit. The Jörmungandr responded instantly. Thanks to its flexible and lightweight structure, it executed a sharp turn on the water without losing speed, scraping right past the side of Eric's ship. The oars of the enemy vessel snapped into pieces with a deafening crunch as the hull of the Jörmungandr slammed into them, disabling Eric's ship on one side. Grappling hooks out, Halvar roared. Torstein's men threw iron-hooked ropes that dug into the wood of the enemy ship, locking the 2 vessels together in the middle of the raging sea. Halvar was the first to leap onto the enemy deck, roaring like a demon out of legend. His first axe blow split the shield of the first enemy in his path. Beside him, Skardi the blacksmith brought down Eric's warriors with crushing strikes from his hammer. The battle on the enemy deck was fierce and bloody. The wooden floor quickly grew slippery with blood and rain. Eric's men outnumbered Torstein's crew, but they lacked the desperation and fury of men fighting to protect their home and their ship. Suddenly, a massive figure carved his way through the melee. It was Eric the Bloodaxe himself. He wore gleaming chainmail, a bearskin cloak, and carried a giant 2-handed axe dripping red. Torstein, Eric bellowed in a deep voice. One-eyed old fool, I will send you to hell and take your sacred wooden ship. Come and get it if you can, dog, Jarl Torstein answered, stepping forward with his sword raised. The 2 leaders clashed in the center of the deck. The impact of their weapons echoed like thunder. Eric attacked with the brutal strength of a giant, forcing Torstein back and making him cover up behind his shield. The wood of the Jarl's shield cracked under Eric's ferocious blows. Meanwhile, the other 3 enemy ships were maneuvering to encircle the fight and board the Jörmungandr from the sides. If those ships arrived in time, Torstein's crew would be completely overwhelmed. We have to cut the ropes, Einar shouted to Halvar while dodging an enemy spear thrust. If the other ships trap us here, we all die. I'm not leaving without Eric's head, Halvar replied, cutting down another foe with his sword. In that moment, Eric delivered a devastating overhead strike with his heavy axe. Torstein raised his shield to block it, but the wood gave out completely, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The blow knocked the old Jarl off his feet, sending him flat onto his back on the wet deck. Eric raised his axe for the killing blow. For Odin, Halvar screamed, charging like lightning toward Eric. Halvar slammed his shoulder into Eric, throwing the giant off balance. The two warriors tumbled across the deck, exchanging axe swings and fists in a desperate struggle. Halvar managed to draw his hunting dagger and drove it between the plates of Eric's armor. The giant let out a painful roar, dropped his weapon, and fell heavily onto the timber. Seeing their legendary leader fall, the surviving mercenaries on the wolf ship lost all resolve. They began jumping into the sea to try swimming toward the other ships. "Cut the ropes. Back to the ship," Jarl Torstein ordered, pulling himself up with Skardi's help. The warriors rushed back to the Jörmungandr, hacking away the iron hooks binding them to the enemy vessel. The remaining 3 ships in Eric's fleet were now just meters away, their archers ready to fire. "To the oars," Einar yelled. "We have to clear out before they close the gap." With the sail damaged by fire and the wind blowing against them, the only escape was the sheer force of the crew's arms. 40 men took their seats, exhausted, wounded, and bleeding, pulling the oars in perfect synchronization. The Jörmungandr began to pull away step by step. The 3 enemy ships tried to pursue, but they were far too heavy to catch the agile oak vessel over short distances. However, the danger was far from over. The sky turned as black as night. The storm that had been brewing all afternoon erupted with unprecedented violence. Waves swelled into towering mountains of dark water over 10 meters high. "Look out!" the lookout screamed from the bow. A massive wave crashed over the side of the ship, hurling it violently toward a labyrinth of sharp rocks protruding from the water like dragon's teeth. It was the dreaded Coast of Mists, a graveyard of ships where no one survived. "The current is dragging us straight into the rocks," Halvar yelled, fighting the force of the sea. Amid the pitch-black storm and blinding rain, the black stone eyes of the carved serpent head seemed to gleam with a strange light. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, revealing a narrow gap between the razor-sharp rocks, a passage far too tight for any normal ship. "The ship will buckle if we go through there," Skardi cried out in fear. "It will break apart." "It won't break," Einar shouted with blind faith in his craft. "Hold the line. Let the wood breathe." Jarl Torstein aimed the prow straight into the gap between the rocks. The Jörmungandr entered the narrow channel. The sea pressed in from both sides, and the rocks scraped inches from the hull. The wooden vessel twisted, flexing with incredible elasticity to conform to the shape of the passage. The iron rivets groaned, and the planks whined under the monstrous pressure, but the sacred oak held strong. The ship slid through the hellish gap like a snake slithering between stones, finally breaking out into the open sea, leaving the rocks and the enemy ships behind, none of which dared to follow the ghost ship's path. When the storm finally began to subside, the crew collapsed onto the deck, exhausted but alive. The loot of gold and silver was safe below deck. Jarl Torstein walked to the bow, where the wooden serpent head still stared into the horizon. He ran his hand over the face of the monster Einar had carved. "We survived the Saxons, Eric, and the rocks of death," the Jarl said in a steady voice. "But the old priest's prophecy has not yet been fully fulfilled. The ship will demand its final price before we reach home." Einar looked out over the quiet morning sea, knowing in his heart that the Jörmungandr's final journey was only just beginning. The journey back to the northern lands began on a strangely calm sea. The freezing waters reflected a heavy, gray sky, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Aboard the Jörmungandr, the 40 warriors rested. The wooden deck was lined with chests of silver, fine fabrics, and Saxon weapons, but the mood inside the ship was not one of celebration. Einar sat by the keel, inspecting every plank with his calloused fingers. The ship had survived the storm, the rocks, and the battle against Eric, but the continuous pounding of the sea had left deep scars. Some of the wooden planks groaned softly, almost like a human sigh. "The oak is tired, Jarl," Einar said to Torstein, who was staring unblinkingly at the horizon. "We all are, carpenter," the Jarl replied, touching the scar on his face. "But as long as the wind pushes us, we will reach Hordaland. Our families are waiting for us." Suddenly, a thick, freezing wind swept down from the north. It was no ordinary storm. It was a dense, white fog that burned the skin like frozen fire. Visibility vanished completely within seconds. The sun went dark, and the natural compass of the sea became useless. "Keep the oars in the water," Halvar shouted, trying to peer through the white wall. In the middle of that deathly silence, the water around the ship began to glow with a ghostly green light. No enemy ships or sea monsters emerged from the fog, but a terrifying sound did. The icy song of the Randaeatr, the daughters of the sea goddess, who lures sailors to the ocean floor before ever letting them return home. The ship shuddered out of nowhere. An icy current seized the structure of the Jörmungandr, dragging it toward a massive whirlpool of dark water that opened right in the center of the mist. "It's Ransmaw," Skardi the blacksmith screamed, dropping to his knees. "She wants to drag us down." "Not today," Halvar bellowed, lunging for the central oar. "Pull with everything you've got." The men pulled on the oars in desperation, but the current was an invisible monster of unrelenting power. The ship's timber groaned as never before. Einar heard two of the main iron rivets near the bow snap under the pressure. The planks began to pull apart slowly, letting streams of freezing water seep inside. The old blind priest had warned them before they set sail. "This ship will demand lives to pay its toll. The ship won't hold against the current if we stay loaded," Einar yelled, standing up amid the panic. "We have to lighten the load. Throw the silver into the sea." The warriors looked at one another, hesitating for a single second. They had bled and seen their brothers die for that treasure. But Halvar didn't think twice. He grabbed the first chest of silver coins and hurled it over the side into the current. "Silver won't buy your life at sea," Halvar roared. Into the water, one by one, the men began throwing the bags of gold, the chests, and the captured weapons into the whirlpool. With every pound that sank to the ocean floor, the Jörmungandr rose a few inches higher above the raging waters, responding to the desperate effort of the rowers. Yet the whirlpool would not give up. The ship's bow remained trapped by the power of the current, and the carved serpent head began to submerge into the green water. In that moment, Jarl Torstein walked toward the front of the vessel. He removed his fur cloak and looked at his men with his single gleaming eye. He was wounded from the battle against Eric and knew his time in this world was coming to an end. "Einar," the Jarl said in a strangely calm voice that stilled the panic on board. "You built the finest ship that ever crossed these seas. You protected my men. Now it's my turn to protect the ship." "Jarl, what are you going to do?" Halvar asked, stepping toward him. "A king does not return home empty-handed if his men must pay the price," Torstein answered with a resolute smile. "Odin calls me to his halls." Jarl Torstein drew his sword, plunged it deep into the base of the wooden figurehead to secure it one last time, and with a brave leap, threw himself into the center of the icy whirlpool, offering his own life to the spirits of the sea. A sudden silence fell over the ocean, as if the waters had received the sacred payment they had demanded since the day of the launch. The roaring current died instantly. The whirlpool vanished, the white fog split in two, and the setting sun illuminated a peaceful sea. Ahead of them, just a couple of miles away, rose the massive mountains of Hordaland and the entrance to their home fjord. The Jörmungandr glided slowly into the calm waters of Vik fjord as night fell. The light of village torches glowed along the shore. The entire tribe rushed to the beach to welcome the expedition. The ship settled gently onto the frozen sand. The warriors stepped down one by one, exhausted, wounded, and without their gold, but alive and holding their families close amid tears of relief. Halvar walked over to the village elders and told them the truth. How the ship had ridden the giant waves, how it had defeated the Saxons, how it had survived Eric's fleet, and how Jarl Torstein had given himself to the gods to save his crew. Einar remained alone on the vessel, running his hands over the wood of the sacred oak. The ship was covered in scars, its sail torn, and its hull marked by salt and battle. But it was still standing. The soul of the ancestral tree and the sacrifice of its Jarl lived on inside the timber. The next day, the tribe decided that the Jörmungandr would never sail again. It had fulfilled its sacred destiny. High on the hill overlooking the sea, the men dug a great mound in the earth. They placed the ship in the center, surrounded by sacred stones, shields, and weapons in honor of Jarl Torstein and the fallen. Einar mounted the wooden serpent head facing out toward the ocean, so it would continue to protect the village for centuries to come. Years later, whenever the youth of the tribe asked Einar how to build an invincible ship, the old carpenter would always look toward the hill and give the same answer. A great ship is not made of wood and iron alone. It is made with respect for the gods, the strength of men rowing together, and a soul that never fears the storm.